All right, so continuing my rant series from earlier this week, I want to talk to you guys about what matters for games. Not necessarily in terms of game development, but in terms of the end user enjoyment. What are the most important aspects of video games? And in general, this is going to vary from person to person. There isn't going to be one specific aspect that is more important than another on the whole, because again, one person's going to value something over another. To give you an example, some people are going to really be into story, and regardless of what the gameplay is like, regardless of resolution and frame rates and visuals, elements, and even controls, the story is what's going to matter to them most of all. For other people, it's going to be about the gameplay. For other people, it's going to be about performance. For some people, it's just all of the above. There are so many different aspects. Hey, maybe you're someone who just plays video games for the music, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I am going to talk in terms of my own tastes and in terms of the way I view the importance of certain aspects of gaming. And I want to get this out there right now because I feel like some people are going to just automatically assume I don't care. Resolution and frame rate do matter. There is a specific reason I have built a custom PC that can do 4K at 60 plus FPS. Although technically my monitors are only 60 hertz, so 60 FPS is actually the max I'll be able to see on my screens. But whatever, you know what I mean. I like high fidelity resolution and frame rates. I feel like all of that is a net positive. And if it was possible for Switch, if it was possible for heck even the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 Pro to run games at 4K and 60 FPS, I would be all about that because I'm a tech enthusiast. I don't know how many people know that. I'm a tech enthusiast. I like the making games visually and just performance-wise run at their best possible performance and visual quality. Now, that's actually not what's most important, though, because I've talked about this before, but it doesn't matter how much you shine a turd of a video game. It's still going to be a turd of a video game. You can take Superman 64 and put it in 4K and run it at 120 FPS, and it doesn't make it a good game. It doesn't make it enjoyable. It doesn't make it any better than it was back on the N64, if we're being completely honest. So, yes, obviously, resolution and frame rate make games better, but they're not what makes a good game. And this is kind of the basis of the rant today. And the discussion, really, I think it's more of a discussion than a rant. I don't know I'm going to get too angry in this one. But it's that there are so many aspects of video games that are massively more important. And I feel like this is a really important conversation to have in light of recent releases on Switch, whether it's Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy, or whether it's Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus, which drops down to 360p, which really bothers some people, and occasionally drops down to 25 FPS. There's this thought process out there that because of this, it devalues these games. And if that is something that you think is devalues the games, you're not wrong. Because, yes, the games can be better elsewhere. Even the Crash Insane Trilogy. Not a lot of people are really talking about this, but the Crash Insane Trilogy does look worse on Switch. I don't know if it's not just because it doesn't run at 4K, but Crash himself doesn't have the fur kind of textures going on with him, right? There's not like these individual hairs on his body. It's more of a flat-based texture, and this was, of course, a sacrifice for Switch. Maybe an acceptable sacrifice for some people, but there's going to be other people that are going to enjoy that visual element. Now, here's my thing, though. Regardless of if it's Crash or Wolfenstein 2 or Doom or anything else on Switch, I feel like the most important thing with video games is that they're fun. You need to have a good game just in terms of the gameplay. Now, Nintendo has emphasized this many times over the years that gameplay matters above all else. I'm not necessarily sure I agree that it matters above all else because there are specific games that are built around story elements. As an example, the Telltale series of games. We even have some of them on Switch with Batman, and we're getting Game of Thrones and stuff as well on Switch in the future, and The Walking Dead. And I think we're getting the final chapter of The Walking Dead on Switch. When you have those some more story-based games, there obviously the story itself matters more than the gameplay. But again, this is going to vary game to game. In general, gameplay is what matters most. And this is why I chiefly am okay with Wolfenstein and Crash and Doom and other games on Switch that maybe don't run at the best levels they can run at, because the gameplay itself is just so fundamentally great. And I don't think that's something that we should be taking for granted, is how amazing the gameplay is. This is one reason Breath of the Wild stands out so much last year, in a year where there were so many amazing video games that came out, because the gameplay was just that good. And guess what? Breath of the Wild runs at 30 FPS, runs at sub 30 FPS on Wii U and Switch. So like, these same issues that people complain about Wolfenstein 2 were present with a console exclusive game of the year like last year, and people just accepted it because the gameplay was so good that despite the low frame rates, it was a ton of fun. So there's like that double standard that goes on sometimes. So a console, or not, it wasn't even a console exclusive, but Game of the Year last year had these issues, but it was still fantastic anyways, because it doesn't matter that the frame rate was lower when the gameplay was that good, or that the resolution wasn't a full 1080p. It doesn't matter when the gameplay is that good. So I want to emphasize that I feel like gameplay is the most important aspect. And this is one reason that I think Super Mario Odyssey, as an example, got a lot of praise last year as well, because the gameplay, the fundamental gameplay in Super Mario Odyssey is that like at the best Mario's ever been, in my opinion. Like the actual fundamental act of playing the game is the best I've ever seen. Doesn't mean the level design is the best, doesn't mean that the visuals are the best, it doesn't mean the enemy designs are the best, or the storytelling is the best, or the collectibles are the best, or the side quests are the best, but just the act of jumping around and doing things in the environment, I feel like is the best Mario has ever been. So again, gameplay matters a ton. And I know I just mentioned 2 Nintendo games. It's not just Nintendo games. Doom and Wolfenstein, God of War. God of War this year, as visually impressive as God of War is on PlayStation 4, it's the gameplay that really took people by surprise, because you can have something that's this visual feast for your eyes. Same with Horizon Zero Dawn last year. But if the gameplay isn't like just utterly fantastic, none of it matters. And the gameplay for Horizon Zero Dawn, for God of War, for Breath of the Wild, for Odyssey, for Doom, for Wolfenstein 2, it's just it is the best of the best of the best. And this is what we expect, or at least should expect, out of AAA games. But any games in general, even down to indie games. Hollow Knight moved 250,000 units on Switch in the first few days. You know why that's the case? Because the gameplay in Hollow Knight is just utterly like perfection for what Hollow Knight is. Same was true of Celeste. Same was true of Golf Story last year. Like Stardew Valley, it doesn't have to be a AAA game to have perfect gameplay. Typically, AAA games are going to have the better visuals, but indie games as well can really focus hardcore on game. In fact, I think indie games in general are a good example of why gameplay matters above everything else. It doesn't matter the resolution, the frame rate, the art style, all that stuff is secondary to the actual act of playing the game and how that feels in your hands, whether it's with a controller or whether it's with a Switch. So, gameplay really matters more than anything. I think that's something in general most of us can agree upon, unless it's a very, very heavy story-focused game. As an example, Late Shift doesn't really have gameplay. It's a decision-based game. So ultimately, Late Shift, in terms of its storytelling, is going to matter more than the gameplay, because there's not really gameplay per se. It's just decisions you make along the way. Now, that being said, after that, we obviously get into some of the nitty-gritty. And a lot of this is going to be completely subjective. The storytelling, I think, is very, very important in games that are storytelling-based. Not all games are story-based. There's puzzle games. There's platformers that don't really have a story. It's just, there's infinite runners and a whole bunch of examples of games that story doesn't really matter for. But for a game that's going to have story, I think story is important. Even if it's over the top, like I think Wolfenstein 2's story so far is very, very over the top. It's kind of part of the charm of the story, is that it takes itself seriously almost to hilarious levels for some of the ridiculous things that are happening in that game. But you can't tell I'm smiling, like I'm just grinning over here at some of the craziness of that story. I don't want to spoil it for anyone on Switch who's just getting into it, but it's a very crazy story, and I really like it a lot. But storytelling matters in video games, I think, a lot. I don't know if it's more important than the visual presentation, because the visual presentation can complement the gameplay, but story is very important, as is the music that helps create the atmosphere. And there are some games I feel like have amazing music, and other games that I feel like are just okay. I didn't talk about music in my Mighty Tennis Aces review, and there's a reason for that, because the music itself wasn't anything to write home about. It was just okay. It's about what you expect, and I like to get the unexpected. I like to be wowed. I like to be being more engrossed in the game because of the music. Breath of the Wild does this with its subtleness, but that doesn't mean that's the only way a soundtrack can get you into it. God of War, as an example, has a very epic style soundtrack, and that really brought me into the world as well. So there's different approaches to that, and there's no right or wrong, but it's obviously music is important and storytelling is important, and I kind of put them on the same level of importance, because both of those things are what engross you into the game and bring the gameplay full circle. Now we get into the visual elements, and here is where we get into a lot of subjectiveness, because a lot of people are going to talk about frame rate, and a lot of people are going to talk about resolution. And here's one thing I'm going to say about both of those. Frame rate is more important than resolution. Frame rate affects gameplay directly in every single video game. There are games where, yes, the visual quality and the high resolution can affect certain things in gameplay, but that's not true of every game, whereas frame rate affects everything. And if I had it my way, every single video game in existence would be 60 FPS. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And there are various reasons for that. Some of it's just games choosing to push more visual quality than in terms of performance, which actually affects gameplay, but that's just my personal preference. That being said, it doesn't mean I think games are unplayable if they're not 60 FPS. There are some people that feel like if you're not 60 FPS, you're unplayable. I don't feel that way. I think most games in general are perfectly fine anywhere between 20 and 30 FPS. I would prefer 30 FPS, period, and nothing goes below that. But if something does dip down to 22, 23, 24, 25, I'm okay with that. It's when things get into the teens that I start to have some real issues, because it really jogs you out. And when you're in the teens, that's when you're going to start seeing a lot more screen tearing. You might see it at 22 and 23 FPS, but you're for sure going to notice screen tearing down in the teens. So to me, anything that's basically 25 to 30 FPS is still playable in my book. If it dips a little bit below 25 for brief moments, I can handle that. But anything in the teens, to me, it's basically unacceptable in today's day and age. It wasn't necessarily as bad when I was a kid. I remember playing some PC games and even games on the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1 and 2 that occasionally dipped down to 15 frames. There were some games that just ran at 15 frames, and that was playable for me as a kid. But now that I've experienced at least 30 FPS for so long, it's really hard for me to just go back to 15 frames. So unless it's like a specific puzzle game that's really, really slow paced, I don't think that 15 frames is defendable in today's world. And thankfully, we don't really have games that run at 15 frames, unless you're setting your settings wrong on PC and making your PC run at 15 frames a second. It's not really something that most of us experience anymore, and I don't think it's something that we need to worry about on Switch, whether it's AAA ports or whether it's indie games or Nintendo games. You're not going to see things down in the teens very, very frequently. Now, if you notice, I haven't talked much about resolution, because I don't think resolution matters as much as any other visual element in the game. This includes art style and art direction. This includes whether or not there's anti-aliasing. I think that's even more important than resolution, because anti-aliasing is going to give you sharp edges, as an example, or smooth edges, I guess the better way to talk about anti-aliasing, because if anti-aliasing is on, everything just looks smoother. Regardless of the resolution, you can have 4K resolution, but if you don't have anti-aliasing, everything just looks really, really jaggy and wonky. Whereas with anti-aliasing on, it looks a lot smoother. So I think anti-aliasing is even more important than resolution. There's obviously level of detail, depth of field. There's lighting and shaders and shadows And all of this, I think, is a lot more important than resolution. I say this because I play games at all sorts of resolutions. Obviously, at an ideal level, everything should just be 4K and have all of this amazing stuff and be 60 FPS. But on consoles, there's always sacrifices being made for various hardware configurations. If you're ever going mobile technology, whether it's on your phone or a Switch or anything else, is never going to be the same as being able to build a box you can put under your TV, whether it is an Xbox or a PlayStation or Google's potential home console, or whether it is a custom built media PC or whatever the case may be. That's just the way it is. Mobile technology is smaller. There's got to be sacrifices. They don't have as good a heat dissipation. There's just going to be limitations there. And this is before we get into the fact that it has to run off a battery, which introduces its own limitations. Basically, the Switch runs on 7 watts, which is garbage for basically any other platform out there when it comes to gaming. So it's amazing that we see some of these certain games on a system that runs at 7 watts. Just crazy. Now, that being said, while I enjoy high-resolution stuff, there are sacrifices I'm willing to make in specific situations, and everything else I talked about I feel like is just a more important aspect of a visual presentation than resolution. And I say this because I still occasionally, even though I talk about the 3DS being dead for me, I still turn on my 3DS now and then. I still play on my children's 2DS now and then. And what we have to remember is that essentially the 3DS and 2DS present games at 240p. Now, I think a good example to prove this point is Captain Toad Treasure Tracker. So Captain Toad Treasure Tracker is coming out on Switch and 3DS very, very soon, and is already released on Wii U. And if we just look at the resolutions, we're looking at a top end of 720p on Wii U, a top end in docked mode on Switch at 1080p, and then obviously only 240p on 3DS. Now, there's a slight tweak in gameplay differences between how they all work with pointers and touchscreens and all that. But setting those gameplay differences aside, which I feel like are going to come down to personal preference, it's very clear that at least when it comes to the visuals and the resolution, the best version is on Switch, the second best version is on Wii U, and the least attractive version is on 2DS with that, way sub-standard def, half of standard def essentially, resolution. But from what we have seen of gameplay, from what we have seen of impressions, and from what we have seen of people that have actually touched it, the 3DS version is extremely enjoyable, and many people say just as good as the Switch and the Wii U version. And that is because of the fact that resolution just doesn't matter when it comes to how good a game is. A game can sit there and run on a small screen at 240p and be just as enjoyable as playing it on your big 65-inch 4K TV with a Switch, or 1080p TV if you prefer. 4K TVs, I think, sometimes quality of 4K TVs also come down to the upscalers that the TV has, but that's neither here nor there. It's obviously that the Switch version looks best, the Wii U version looks second best, and way behind that is the 3DS version. Yet all three versions are perfectly viable, and all three versions are equally as fun as the other version. It's just going to come down to what way do you want to play, what platform do you want to play on, and what sacrifices are you willing to make. Maybe you're not willing to sacrifice down to 240p, so you're going to buy it on Switch, or you're going to buy it on Wii U because you already own a Wii U and it's cheaper on Wii U. So there's that to consider as well. There's a lot of reasons that go into why customers purchase certain versions of games. But reality is that resolution isn't necessarily a deciding factor for a lot of people. It's going to be what platform do they own is usually the primary deciding factor on what version of a game they're going to buy. I'll give you an example here with Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. There are, believe it or not, a lot of people who only own a Switch. They don't own a PlayStation 4. They don't own an Xbox One. They don't own a gaming PC. Their only gaming platform, their primary gaming platform is Switch. And in the case of Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus, well, it sucks it drops down to 360. To them, they might not care. They might have came from owning a 3DS and upgraded to a Switch. So even at 360, that is still an upgrade in resolution for them over what they're used to. Or they just don't care that the resolution drops to 360 because Wolfenstein 2 is such a fantastic game that runs at such a solid 30 FPS that that's good enough for them. And it's okay if that's not good enough for you. That's the brilliant thing about options in the marketplace. And that's what I'm saying about Captain Toad Treasure Tracker as well. It's okay if you're not fine with it being 240p on 3DS, because you don't have to buy it on 3DS. You can go buy other versions of it that, yes, are technically more impressive, and that's okay too. Maybe you don't want to play it on Switch because you hate the pointer control, so then you'll compromise and get the Wii U version instead, which looks a little bit worse but has the full touchscreen controls and is the originally designed platform for that game. So there's just a lot of things to take in consideration when purchasing games. That I guess the primary thing I want to end this video with, 20 minutes in, is just that we need to be, just as a society, but even as gamers, just more accepting of the fact that not everyone agrees on what the best way to play games is. In general, everyone can agree that in an ideal world, all platforms would be 100% equal. We're talking about in terms of all games being in 4K, all games being 60 FPS, all games having the best of the best visuals, the best of the best gameplay, very similar control schemes, or if they are different control schemes, everything just kind of works, and we would still have all of the variety that we want. We would be able to take some on the go, play under our TV, play in front of our monitors with PCs, be able to play on airplanes and do all this crazy stuff. But the reality is the technology doesn't work that way. And since technology doesn't work that way, there's going to be differences in games across several different platforms, and it's going to be up to the consumer to decide what they want to do and what's acceptable to them. And this is why, no matter how you feel about a game like Wolfenstein 2 on Switch, or how you feel about Doom on Switch, no matter how you feel about Switch games in general that come from third parties or even from Nintendo, we need to remember that at the end of the day, just because you personally might prefer a game at a certain price point, at certain qualities, on other platforms more than you do on Switch, it doesn't mean that that game shouldn't be there on Switch, because a lot of people that own a Switch are going to be okay with the way things are in that game. And you can call it a ripoff, you can call it whatever you want, but at least accept the fact that they want to play that game, and now they have the ability to play it on the platform they want to play it. And you might hate the sacrifices made and might disagree with it, and you are more than welcome to voice those disagreements, but don't tell other people not to enjoy something that you think is ridiculous. And I feel like that's where this conversation starts and ends, because this isn't just a conversation that happens with Switch. It happens with Xbox One X versus PlayStation 4 Pro, and PlayStation 4 versus Xbox, and PC versus everything. PC Master Race, always touting how crappy PlayStation and Xbox is in comparison to the PC. Like, this happens across the video game industry. It's not an exclusive conversation happening with Switch ports. It's happening with Xbox, PlayStation, and PC as well. And I feel like it's just absolutely ridiculous that we have to have arguments about this. It's okay to talk about the things we wish were different or want to be different, but I don't think it's okay to diss entire platforms because of those differences. I don't think it's okay to trash companies who are platform holders over these differences, and I don't think it's okay, especially to trash consumers that are okay with the sacrifices being made to have the game on their given platform. I just don't think these are things that are okay for us as people to do. I think it's okay to be critical of the games, okay to be critical of the game developers. And yes, I'm not saying you can't be critical of platform holders, but you need to take that criticism in mind with the realities of the world. If you would rather Nintendo make an on-par system that's an underbox TV, that is completely understandable, and you are welcome to voice that opinion. But we're talking about Switch for what it is. You can't use that opinion to trash Switch as a portable. Look at it as a 3DS successor if you want, even though Nintendo doesn't, and look at it in that light, and then tell me how crappy Switch is. Anyways, folks, I'm Nathaniel Rumpelchance from Nintendo Prime, and if you like this video, you know what to do, and if you dislike the video, hit that dislike button, subscribe for more content, and I'll catch you in the next one. Yes.